your introduction is quite comprehensive. You were the 24th employer at Cloudflare. There's now 1,300 or over 1,300 people.
Yeah.
You are CTO. You've done a lot. You've advocated to the British Parliament successfully to pardon Alan Turing.
Yeah.
You are advocating to build Sir Charles Babbage's original prototype for the computer from the Victorian era.
Trying to, yeah.
You are advocating to the science community for open source software.
Yes.
Who are you? What are you?
I'm tired. I'm very tired. That's an interesting question. I don't know. I think I've always been interested in the roots of things, like how do things get to where they are and how are they created. So in the case of Charles Babbage's computer, like what was it? What was the core of it? Same thing with Alan Turing, right? He was so fundamental in terms of the theory of computer science. I've always been fascinated at the sort of how do you get to the heart of things. And then in the, you alluded to the open source thing in science. That's really about, one of the problems in science is that there's a vast amount of computer code being used in scientific papers, and most of it is not open source. And there have been quite notable paper retractions where there's been bugs in that software, and it's invisible. And so me and a couple of other, 2 professors in the UK have been trying to get people to publish the code that goes with scientific papers so it can be scrutinized, just like the rest of the papers. So, it's all about getting to the heart of whatever the problem is.
So I can see a connection into your role at Cloudflare, or what might have driven you to Cloudflare. Tell us a bit about your journey with Cloudflare, how you arrived and what you do now.
Well, there's like the simple version, which is I wanted a job. I mean, that's the simple version. The more complicated version is that I had done, so obviously in the introductions that I did a PhD in computer security, so I'd always been interested in the security side of things, fundamental to what Cloudflare does as a cybersecurity company. I always say, by the way, if you don't know what Cloudflare does, you've used our services today without realizing it. You've gone to a website or you've used an app that uses us on the back end to protect that application or that website. And so what we've done is we've taken a look to see if you're a hacker or not, and hopefully we let you through. So we have this very large scale, so that's very much computer security kind of thing. And I had, by chance, actually done a lot of networking stuff as well, and some machine learning stuff. So the beginning of 2000, 2001, done a bunch of machine learning stuff for anti-spam. So actually, when Cloudflare got started, I knew the CEO. I met Michelle, who's the co-founder, and initially I thought this is a terrible idea. No one's ever going to want to pay for this service. I'm never going to go work for them. Good luck to them. Now, to be fair, I had just moved back to the UK after a long time. They were above a nail salon in Palo Alto in California. It stunk of nail polish remover. So I think a lot of that explains a lot of the really early code. It's kind of weird because they were all high on nail polish remover, basically. But what happened was, after about a year, I thought this sounded actually really interesting. There was obviously something happening, and luckily Matthew and Michelle were both happy for me to be in London and stay there and start in my spare bedroom, the London office. And now somehow 260 people are in my spare bedroom. So
it's a big house. So you started as a way of identifying email hacks?
I've lost my... here we go. Back in 2000, 2001, I was very interested in spam, the email spam problem, because at that time, it was not really a solved problem, right? People didn't have Gmail and stuff like that, which was just working really well at filtering it out. So I built a spam filter, which became quite popular, that was mentioned in the introduction, thing called PopFile. And so some of those techniques apply very well for the problems in general on the internet, filtering out bad behavior, so similar sorts of machine learning techniques. But actually, when I started at Cloudflare, I just started as a programmer. I had done a lot of management. I'd been VP of engineering in different companies and stuff like that, and I was tired of doing it, and I thought, I want to go back and write some code. I am an engineer, right? And I wanted to go back, so my actual job title was programmer. I wasn't hired to be the CTO. That came much later on as the company grew. And actually what happened was, there was a third founder of Cloudflare, Lee Holloway, who was the technical founder. And he sadly became very ill and had to leave the company. And he also didn't want to be a manager. He was very much a guy who liked being inside the database and all this kind of stuff. And Michelle Zatlin, who's the co-founder, she said to me one day in San Francisco, do you think you could temporarily take over running engineering since you've done it before? And I was in London. Almost all of engineering was in San Francisco. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that temporarily. And this is now the longest temporary job I've ever had. It's about 7 years in now. And I keep sort of like, can I go back to doing the coding stuff? So, but that was just because I'd done that. And eventually it was like, well, you should probably have the title CTO. And you should go out and talk to customers and explain what we do and give talks and write and things like that. And I think that was actually one of the important culture things at Cloudflare, which was like, the company did not initially have job titles. So Matthew and Michelle and Lee were the founders. Matthew had the title CEO because somebody had to be the CEO. And actually he and Michelle basically almost tossed a coin for it, like one of us needs to have that title. Michelle had a title that was something like head of user experience, which was just like, that's what she thought was the important thing to do. Now her title is COO, we're a public company. So none of us tried to have grandiose titles at the beginning. It was just silly to have that kind of stuff. And Lee, who was the technical founder, I don't think he had a title. He was Lee. And so, the CTO thing came much, much later on. And my actual business cards say programmer on them.
You mentioned when we were chatting before that you actually think giving people lofty titles at the start is a bad idea. Yeah. Why is that?
Well, it's, suppose you give 4 people and you give somebody the title CTO, you're making a hell of a bet on that person that they're going to actually scale up to be the CTO you want when you're 1,000 people or 2,000 people or 10,000 people. And you just paint yourselves into a corner because you've decided to give people these titles. And if you don't give someone a title, then they can progress in different directions and you can make a decision. Oh, actually their skill set turned out this way, they wanted to be this kind of thing, and you don't get these wrenches. So we really tried to not give people titles for a long time. And then what happened was we have this annual retreat where we take people off to a hotel somewhere, get everybody together, and we do workshops on what the staff think we should change in the company and how we should manage things. I mean, it's not actually a democracy, but we listen to the thinking. And one of the things people said was, we need to have a little bit of layering, a little bit of titles, a little bit of structure. And so, so we've kind of resisted introducing structure and titles and all this stuff as long as you can, because it gives you room to move around. And I think that's really one of the big lessons from early on.
At what size did that start happening? Because obviously you're a billion, or your valuation's $5 billion, I think.
I think so, something like that, yeah.
So at what size do you think that's starting to be a good idea to start giving titles and structure?
Well, so in the engineering group, which reports to me, we still do not have a title of senior software engineer.
Right.
There's software engineers. And we keep resisting and how we do that. We do actually have a title which is principal software engineer, which is like really senior people, but we haven't introduced all the layers underneath it, and so we'll wait till we're much bigger. And I think there's about 300 people in my team. I think we actually introduced some more formal titles when we were about 100 people. I think that's when we actually gave some people a manager title, because it was important to recognize that certain people were being managers.
Okay. What does the CTO do then, as from an unstructured role to a structured role? How has your role evolved from being on the tools to now being?
Yeah, I mean, so it can mean very different things in different companies. And that was another reason not to have that title, because we weren't sure what Cloudflare wanted it to mean, right? So in some companies, CTO means the VP of engineering, the person who runs the product engineering and actually builds the products, right? Sometimes it means that. Sometimes it means a sort of visionary who goes out and has visions in public. I'll try not to do that right now. But it sort of goes out and does that kind of speaking kind of stuff. And sometimes it's entirely internal. It's like the architect, not necessarily running the engineering group, but actually the person who lays out the whole architecture of the thing. So in Cloudflare, it's meant different things at different times. So first of all, the reason it was put on my business card originally was that we needed to tell people I was the CTO, because then people would think, oh, Cloudflare's got a CTO. Cloudflare must be an important company. All right, and also one of the reasons why Michelle, for a long time, head of user experience, was suddenly, I'm the chief operating officer, because she is actually the chief operating officer, but we never said it. But sometimes it's useful externally to say that to people. In Cloudflare, so I ran engineering for a long time, the product engineering, and then hired the hierarchy of managers underneath me and built that team up. Now, my role has changed a lot. What the hell am I doing in Australia? Well, because what we need to do is tell the story of what Cloudflare does. And so about 60% of my job is now outbound. It's coming and talking at things, writing, podcasts, all of the communication stuff, which in a way is quite salesy, right? It's not directly salesy, but it's telling the story and getting you to understand who we are and what we do.
Okay, that's quite interesting because I guess you've worked for other startups and you've seen failures
Yes.
at other startups. It definitely seems like you might have learnt from experience in the way that for why you're doing things the way you are now at Cloudflare. Is there anything that you have learnt that you were applying from your previous failures, or not your failures, but failures at companies that you've worked for previously?
I mean, I think there are lots of things you end up learning over time. Some things are just, why the hell did I do it that way in the past? How foolish I was, or how young I was, or inexperienced I was. I think the biggest thing is to listen to people, people's experience, the people around you, their experience, and to be able to listen to what their experience tells them, their skill set tells them. So when I look at the senior management team in Cloudflare, if you look at Matthew and Michelle who run the company, both of them are a lot younger than me and have a lot less operational experience than me. But I look at them and think they have all these different skill sets that I can learn from. And I think that's the most important thing, which is that, I'm never going to be perfect at all these things. And so I look at Matthew and his skills, and I look at Michelle and her skills, and I'm learning from that. And so I think if you just look back over the time I've been working, yeah, sure, there are specific things you could probably point to and say, don't do this, don't do that, don't have job titles too early, don't give people ridiculous bonuses because it doesn't really motivate them. There's all sorts of stuff you do like that. But the most important thing is to look at all the people you're dealing with, no matter how much experience they have, and figure out, what can I learn from this interaction? And that can be, a new programmer who's come out of college. So for example, when I was at university, the cryptographic system we all learnt about was RSA. RSA is close to being defunct, right? So my knowledge is completely out of date. And some of the young cryptographers in the company who know all about elliptic curves can teach me a lot in that area. So there's always something you can learn from interactions with people, and I really, truly believe that's the most important thing. Because then, over time, you get stronger.
Well, my interpretation of what you're doing as you've grown from 20 to 100, 500, now over 1,000, 1,300, is a strong focus on this culture of listening and respect. You're quite famous for tweeting all written down culture statements are bullshit. It seems like you've...
I probably did say that. It sounds like something I might say. Yeah,
It seems like whether you might be consciously aware or not, you really, for me, it seems like you're very much driving that sort of culture of open communication, no boundaries, no walls. Is that...
I mean, there are always boundaries, right? It's silly to say there are no boundaries and no rules, right? Because there are rules, there are boundaries. But I agree with you that open communication is very, very important. And the thing is, if you go back to that quote about, all written down culture statements are bullshit, culture is what you're actually doing. It's not what you say you're doing. It's like what actually happens in the companies, how people actually interact. And if you look at, history of humans, going back, at some point we were sitting around fires that we'd managed to make, telling each other stories. And those stories are repeating our culture. They are the culture, the stories, right? And any culture around the world has a bunch of stories they tell themselves. There might be religious stories, and there might be not religious stories, but that's what you do. And so, one of the things we value very much in Cloudflare, and we actually have this thing of stories internally, like how we dealt with a particular situation, how we made a particular decision. And often you'll see that written on our blog. We'll talk about the story of it, because I'm utterly convinced that humans are wired to both tell stories and really enjoy stories. If you tell somebody a fact, they forget it. If you tell them in the context of a story, somehow their brain's like, oh yeah, we're story machines. So culture for me is about the stories you tell, not about something you write down.
Do you think that I'm hearing this as this has been a critical part of your success. If you're not having a strong focus on roles from the get-go, you're listening to your staff, and when roles are required, you implement them, or titles, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Is culture the reason that you've been able to scale to a $1 billion plus company?
I think culture could have messed it up enormously. I think we could have definitely died through culture, right? So it's important to have instilled a certain culture in the company. It also helps to have made a product that people like and want to pay for. I've worked at a company, so the guy who's the head of engineering who works for me, he and I were sort of co-founders of a company that it was a zombie, what I call a zombie startup. It never died, but it never lived. Right? So it had just enough money to keep going forever, and it actually only last year finally got taken out of its misery by getting bought by somebody. And that company, it was fantastic. You could have come in and taught computer science from our code base. We were an incredible collaborative team. It was a wonderful place to work. Our code was amazing. It was incredibly stable. But there were like 10 customers in the world. And it's like, great. So, fantastic. There's only so much money you can extract from 10 people, no matter how rich they are. So, you also have to have a product that people want. And so, there is a market timing thing. But the culture is very, very important. Now, I'll give you one story about something we do at Cloudflare. So, every single person who goes through the interview process at Cloudflare, before a final decision is made, they speak to an executive. And they speak to one of 4 people. They either speak to me, or they speak to Matthew, who's the CEO, or Michelle, who is the COO, or Janet, who is the head of people. And the 4 of us share out the work. 20-minute interview, we have a discussion, we get to know the person, they can ask questions of an executive. Last year I did 132 interviews like that. And so did everybody else, as we were talking to interview candidates. Why do we do that? 2 reasons. One is so that we get a sense for a sort of quality control sense of who's coming to the organization. Do we think those people are going to work well with the rest of the organization? But also so that new employee, when you're a 1,300-person company or a 2,000-person company, has spoken to an executive. In many companies of that size, the executives are completely untouchable. And what we want is that anybody could walk up to us and say, hey, there's a problem. There's a thing here. I want you to know about this thing. And the only way we can do that is making sure we're approachable. Every year at our annual get-together, Matthew puts up on the screen his personal mobile phone number and says, you can call me. And some people do. I mean, it's a scary thing to call the CEO, right? But people do. And so that's a really important thing to do, is to have that connection with the people. And what are we looking for? We're looking for curiosity as the number one aspect. Everything's changing. Internet is changing. Market is changing. People are changing as they go through life. If you're incurious, then you probably should go work for some giant defense contractor or something and move widgets around or something. If you're working for a startup, and I still consider Cloudflare to be a startup even though it's a public company, because it's still small, and as Michelle likes to say, we're just getting started. We've done all this stuff, but we're still growing. You have to have curiosity. Otherwise, what are you doing? Life is so boring. And the other side, the flip side, is we're also looking for people who will teach others. Because, we're still a small company. Not everybody knows everything. I know less and less, right? The bigger the company gets, the less I know. Right? Originally, when there were 24 people, I had a huge impact, right? Now you think, well, you're at the pinnacle of this thing. That means I have no idea what's going on in the organization. And sometimes people assume I do, and they're like, do you know about Project X? I'm like, really? What the hell's Project X? And come tell me about it. So, you have to have that communication happening. You have to have people able to tell you stuff, otherwise you get lost.
How does that work when you have multiple offices? You work from Portugal.
I do. I work from Lisbon in Portugal, yeah.
So I guess there's an element of, I could call it remote work culture. How do you get around that?
So we have 13 offices globally. From the engineering perspective, we really have 4 main offices, so San Francisco, Austin, Texas, London, and Lisbon. When you're 24 people sitting around the table, it's easy. Right now, when my organization is about 300 people, what do? Well, some of it you can do through actual regular communication, like face-to-face kind of communication. We do have get-togethers, we bring the team together, we do all that kind of stuff. Some of it you can do through tools like chat, the Atlassian suite, things like that, so you can start doing those things. But I find that the most valuable thing from my perspective is to walk up to random people and talk to them. Now, that sometimes scares the hell out of people, right? Because when you're really small, see, for me, I'm like this one guy at this small company. Now, if you're a new employee coming in and you're employee number 1,500, I'm an executive, and that's a terrifying thing, right? I might fire you or something. But I have a tendency just to walk up to people and ask them what they're doing. And actually, I was at one of our customers is Sodexo, which is this massive catering company based in France. This global catering company, does big events. And I was at their office, and there was a very elderly man in the cafeteria in Paris. And I remarked on it to somebody there, and he's like, that guy is the founder of Sodexo, and he's almost 90 years old, and he comes in every day, and he sits down next to somebody in the cafeteria and asks them what they're doing. And just to get a sense for what does the company do, what is happening in my company, even though he's basically retired. So I think talking to people, just literally random conversations. One of the reasons I don't really like remote work, where you have lots of people distributed all over the place, you really lose the ability to have those random conversations which turn out to be so valuable, where you bump into somebody and you spark something off.
I want to move on from culture. There will be questions the audience can ask, so if you want to ask more about culture, because I feel like we could talk about this all day. But we're talking about scaling a $1 billion business, building products. So you started with quite a single product. Now you are absolutely ginormous in your product suite.
I guess. It feels tiny, right? It feels big and tiny at the same time. It's this weird double think thing going on.
Yeah. Well, I guess you seem to be pursuing a singular vision. Would that be correct? What would that vision be?
So really, really early on, we very, very clearly thought that everybody was going to depend on the internet, and that the internet was fundamentally flawed because when it was created without security, almost completely without security. And happily, it was created without security because that actually allowed it to flourish. In fact, we would have throttled the internet in its early years if we'd built in security, because it would have been the security of the 1970s. And actually, if you look at the founding documents, the RFCs of the internet, the only security they talk about is we're going to mark everything as unclassified, secret, confidential, and top secret. So it's all about Defense Department kind of stuff, and they can actually mark each packet on the internet as this is a secret packet, this is a top secret packet. So, thank goodness we didn't do that, and we allowed it. But fundamentally, Cloudflare, we said there's all these missing things, and they have to be fixed. There's all these problems of DDoS and hackers breaking into websites, and people's home internet not being secure enough. And so that's been the vision all along, which is like, let's fix these fundamental issues in the internet because everyone depends on it, and companies need services to do that. And the reality was, there were probably 20 companies globally who could really get the most out of the internet. If you were Google or Alibaba or Yahoo or Amazon, a tiny number of companies, you had the staff, you had the expertise, you had the time, you had the money to have a fast, secure, great internet. If you're anybody else, you were lagging. And we said, that's silly, we can democratize that. We'll sell you the same kind of security, the same kind of performance as a service.
And so how do you go, when you're small, when you're employee number 24, you have a focus of product or single product.
Yeah.
How do you go about choosing and finding success expanding into new product lines?
Well, we've had a very clear vision. We almost mapped out exactly what we were going to do 8 years ago, 9 years ago. We knew this is the direction. Now, the interesting thing is, if you have a very clear vision like that, is when you deviate from it. So when you change your mind, right? Because, people who don't change their minds don't change anything, is that fantastic quote. And so the surprising thing is, at some point, especially when you're a small company, it's hard to imagine the problems large companies have, because you tend to think of the agility and flexibility of small companies. And then you go into a giant, conglomerate, and they've got all sorts of issues, legacy stuff, government requirements. There's layers and layers of other stuff they have to deal with, which you never thought about in the beginning. So the interesting thing is, how do you, from that path, say, okay, we're going to have to broaden out actually what our product suite is, because these large companies who are paying us a fortune, they actually have to worry about government reporting for compliance perspective, or they have a huge contractor workforce they have to onboard and offboard very rapidly over time. We didn't build that flexibility into our product. or they need to ingest data from us into their own systems because they do their own security stuff because they've got their own security team. So you end up sort of expanding out from that. And I think the hard part is, how do you not go down a rat hole, which is this one customer wants this one feature over here. So we have refused to do that, which is we will walk away from a deal if somebody says, look, we'll pay you a lot of money if you'll just build this magical widget that connects to this one thing that we have over here. And we look at it and go, no one else wants that thing. And if no one else wants it, you can't sell it a second time, you can't sell it a 10th time, a 100th time. And the beauty of software is you can sell the same thing over and over and over again. If you start doing custom work for your customers, you're a consulting company, you're not a software company. And that's fine, but say you're a consulting company and you're a completely different business. Don't pretend that's okay. If it can't be sold more than once, it's a mistake.
But you've got a lot of customers. How does Cloudflare do that at the scale that you do that today?
I mean, how do we refuse?
Not refuse, but choose which ones, what is a good validated customer problem to be solving?
Well, the good news is that in the sort of 8-9 years I've been at the company, what we thought the vision was of where we'd end up is where we've ended up, which is that we're all using the internet and we're relying on it, and businesses are relying on it for absolutely everything. So in many ways, it's more a question of qualifying where is the customer in their own personal company journey of using the internet or altering their internal processes, because some companies are very legacy and some are further along and some are even further along. So it's more a question of where do we fit into that transformation that companies are undergoing, more than do they actually need it. Ultimately, all companies on the internet need some kind of cybersecurity solution, whether it's a Cloudflare one or somebody else's. So it's like, okay, where does ours fit into this company's needs, and also, particularly with large companies, where they are in a roadmap, because they're not agile. They're going to be doing things, in 6-month, 1 year, 5-year projects. And so you've got to slot in, right? And that means, particularly for the big companies, a really long relationship. It might take you a year to have a sale, 2 years, depending on the conversation and where they are. You can't push a big rock and make it come to you.
What advice would you have for a startup that might be at, employee 20 to 100? That's when this stuff starts getting hard to do, because there's so many things they're trying to do. And you've been part of those startups that maxed out at 10 customers. Great code, great culture, no customers. How can they, I guess, operationalize this so that they can continue to find and validate new opportunities?
Well, it's just honesty, right? It's just honesty. Are you being honest about where you are? So, for example, very early on at Cloudflare, I wanted us to build a very specialized computer for DDoS mitigation to protect against attack. And the reason I wanted us to build it was completely the wrong reason, which was I thought that was a really cool project. And I was like, if we could do this, it'd be really clever, and we do all this really clever code. No one gives a damn about that in the real world, right? That doesn't matter at all. What matters is, are you going to be able to scale the business? Is the margin going to be right on this? Are you going to be able to get the customers? And so, I was persuaded not to build that thing. And that's really about honesty, right? Are you being honest with yourselves? And in the previous company that I had founded with Usman and some other folks, we should have been honest and said, the market just isn't big enough for this, and the economics are not there, and we should have probably never done it in the first place. But it was great fun. So, it was fun for a while. So I think it's about really, and the really hard thing about building, what is it, a $5 billion company or what it is it's brutal. It's brutally hard. Things you think are cool, the market might think, no, it's irrelevant. People you liked working with, they might go off in one direction or another. You end up having to get rid of some people. You end up having to replace people. I mean, it's really hard work all the time. And I think it's really easy to watch, like, a BBC documentary about Facebook and how exciting it is and how rich Mark Zuckerberg is and all that kind of stuff, and get caught up in that kind of euphoria of, wow, we're going to be all this amazingly wealthy and all this kind of stuff, and not recognize that it's really hard. It's really hard building businesses, Go talk to somebody who's built a restaurant. It's really, really hard work. There are no shortcuts beyond working the problems that come up every day.
What's the hardest thing you've had to do in that journey?
I mean, I hate firing people. And actually one time I had, there are people you have to get rid of. It happens. And I've had to do it many times. And it still really, really upsets me every time. And now that I have an Apple Watch, one time I was getting rid of something, my watch suddenly goes like, and it's like, you might be having a heart attack. It's like, we've detected an arrhythmia. And then, you're sitting down and your heart rate is 160 beats per minute. What's wrong with you? And I'm like, well, because I'm really upset about, this. And that's hard. Unless you're completely heartless, and most people aren't actually heartless, you're thinking about the person, their future, their career, what's happening to them, and it's very hard.